When Avraham Avinu is sitting there with the Eibishter visiting him 3 days after he's had his bris, 3 men, which are actually malachim, pass by, and Avraham Avinu says, "Don't go, don't pass me by." Who is he speaking to? Rashi will offer 2 interpretations, neither of which is absolutely solid, which is why we need the 2 interpretations. And for that reason, he'll tell us where these interpretations come from, so we appreciate the context of something that doesn't fit so perfectly with the pshat. In Pasuk, the Pasuk that says, Vayomar, and Avraham Avinu said, Adnai or Adoinoi, depending on who he's referring to. If I find favor in your eyes, Al Nasavar me Alavdecha, do not pass your servant or leave your servant, depending on who he's speaking to. So Rashi quotes those words, and he says in his Mefarish, who's he speaking to? Legadol Shabahem. He's speaking to the senior of the 3 personalities who were walking past. Amar, that's who he was talking to. Kra'am kulam adoinim, and he referred to all of them as adoinoi, my masters. But Legadol Amar, and to the most prestigious or senior of them, he said, Al Nasaber, don't pass me by. And of course, if the leader of the group is not going to pass Avraham by, then everybody else is going to stay as well. And then he tells us, if you go with this interpretation, the word Adonai is not the name of Hashem, but rather it's my masters. Then he gives a second explanation, which we'll get to in just a moment. But firstly, in this explanation is indemnit verstandig, what doesn't seem to make sense is there's a discrepancy over here. Initially, Rashi says that Avraham Avinu was addressing the most senior member of the group. As Avraham gesagt, Adonai im Novak V'Gomer. Which seems to imply that even though he's using a plural word, my masters, he's actually speaking to one person, the most senior member of the delegation. So Tavo sagt Rashi gleich weiter, kram kulam adonim. So why then does Rashi immediately seem to change and say that he called them all masters if he's only speaking to one of them? So which one is it? Is he speaking to an individual or to the group? Okay, that's the first question. Now let's look at the second explanation. The Nochis Rashi Mamshich, Rashi then continues and says, Dava Acher, there's an alternative explanation. Koideshu, this is actually a name, Adnai, this is the Eibishter's name. He was asking the Eibishter to please wait and not leave while he would run after these guests to invite them in. You're going to say, but the chronology doesn't work over here because we've already been told that he chased after them. And then it says, Vayeira. So you could say, well, the comment was made in this interpretation before he actually ran after them. But as Rashi says, I've already proven before that the Torah doesn't always necessarily say things in the exact order that they unfolded. And so likewise over here, the comment was made to the Eibishter before he actually ran after the Malachim, in spite of the fact that the Pasuk makes it sound like he ran first. So there it's speaking about the fact that the Eibishter is, so to speak, angry with the humanity, and that's after Noach gave birth. And we do the calculation, it doesn't make sense because the Eibishter says, I'm going to limit human lifespan to 120 years. Noach already at this point is older than that, so it must be that the statement was made later on. And likewise over here, the fact that Avraham Avinu is speaking and then chasing the angels is the chronology, but the Psukim don't say it that way. The Psukim first speak about him rushing and then say what he had already commented to the Eibishter in this interpretation. In which case, Dam Verstehen, so now we have a few questions about the relationship between these two commentaries. Because Aleph, Favos darf Rashi sagen zwei Pirushim, how come Rashi needs 2 explanations? Typically, if Rashi can give us an explanation that solves whatever questions we have about the pasuk, he will. And if he gives a second explanation, the implication is that neither explanation was clear enough in its own accord. So why do we need 2 explanations here? And if he is giving us 2 explanations, why then does he first explain the possibility that the word Adonai means my masters, and that's actually a regular word, not a holy word? The Pirush Kodesh Tzveita, whereas the more common expression, which is that it's the Eibishter's name, which is why it's even uncomfortable for us to say otherwise, he puts that as the second explanation. Nochmer, especially Vibald, as Rabbi came is the Torah Adnai Kodesh. Typically throughout the Torah, whenever you see this word, Adnai is the Eibishter's name, and it's a holy name. Kommt the Chayis, as the Pirush Choils, then to suggest that in this particular context it's Adoinai, my masters, and it's a mundane word, as a Taishim for it, Adnai Doi is Andeshvil Berev HaMakomis, which means we're translating the word differently to pretty much everywhere else in the Torah, is Vayeira from Pshutei Shel Mikra Vida Pirush Kodeshu. That's obviously much more distant from the simple understanding of the pasuk than to say it's Hashem's name. And Favos Kumter Al Seh. So why is Rashi putting that as the first explanation if it's the one which is less aligned with the pshat of the pasuk? Rashi is here to explain pshat. And thirdly, Gimel, as das is Chel, sagt Rashi Neshim Pirish Besim Dvarav. This might seem like a nuance, but it's really relevant. How come Rashi gives the first explanation and only afterwards tells us in this context the name is a mundane name? Und as das ist Kodesh, sagt in zweiten Pirish gleich betchilas Pirushe. Whereas in the second explanation, first he prefaces by telling us the name is a holy name, it's the name of the Eibusher, and then he explains what the context is. Was is the Tamashina? Why does he make that distinction in the way that he places the interpretation of whether it's a holy name or not relative to his commentary? After Rashi gives us the two explanations, then he says something which also doesn't seem to be either necessary or placed in the right place. He says, you can find these two opinions in the Medrash Bereshis Rabbah. Is in Demnit Muvan that raises these questions. Number one, who needs to know where it's from? Aleph. Zu was darf Rashi anweisen der Mokke von den Pirushim, chosh berube derube tuter es nit. Why is Rashi quoting his source, which in the vast majority of cases he doesn't? Why do we have to know that it came from the Medrash Rabbah? Number two, Beis. Wenn Rashi bringt zwei Pirushim, will dabei madgish sein. As is einen genommen geworden von Divrei Chazal, usually if Rashi is going to bring multiple explanations and wants us to know that they come from a source from the Chazal, he usually tells us that in the introduction to the commentary. It says in Medrash Rabbah X and Y. So you should have done the same here. First tell us we're dealing with Bereshis Rabbah, then tell us what it says. Right? He could have said it says in Bereshis Rabbah X and Y. It's unusual and it doesn't make sense that he should only after he's given us the two explanations then tell us and it comes from Bereshis Rabbah. And the third point is, when you look in Bereshis Rabbah, you may not find what Rashi is alluding to. Given the Bereshis Rabbah, Shiddufonenu is Don Nor Ein Pirush. Bereshis Rabbah, in the versions we have, only have one of the explanations, as Das is Aloshan Shechol, that here Adoinai means my masters, and it's not a holy word. Was Manon Nemen, so we have to assume, as in the Nusach from Bereshis Rabbah, was Rashi had Gehat, that Rashi obviously had a version of the Bereshis Rabbah, where Verin Gebrach Beide Pirushim, which had both explanations. As Rashi tells us, both expressions are in Bereshis Rabbah. Now that also doesn't make sense. Sabanit movement. The Gemara Shavuos brings both explanations. And there are no different versions about that Gemara, whether it's one or both of the interpretations. So Tefavos is Rashi Metzayin as the Mokkah from Beida Pirushim is Bereshis Rabbah. Why then is Rashi telling us that his source is in Bereshis Rabbah, the source for both quotations? Vastos is not later in Girsa Bereshis Rabbah, which is only according to one version of the Bereshis Rabbah. Und there too, Nita Girsa Rabachas, and it's not even the most common version of the Bereshis Rabbah. Proof being that we don't have it in our Bereshis Rabbah. On Bread Mikta Gemara in Shavuos, why didn't he just say this is a Gemara in Shavuos, which is universal? Everybody would look in the Gemara Shavuos and see that both opinions are there. So what we've got to understand is what's bothering Rashi over here, which is that there seems to be a flow in the psukim that lends itself to Avraham Avinu speaking to the angels much more easily than speaking to the Eibusher. The Bir B'chol said the explanation is this. Noch Vayeira, after it says that Avraham Avinu declared, Adoin, or Adnai, Im Lo Matzasi Chen Gomer, Me'al Avdecha, if I found favor in your eyes, don't pass me by. Steht gleich in die Psukim Shel Achrei, the very next thing that happens in the next psukim, als hemshech von Avraham's rate, which is obviously a continuation of what he's saying. Yukach no me'at mayim, he says, take some water, wash your feet, and I'll bring some bread, and I'll give you food to satiate you. The fact that the Torah does not introduce those comments with another vayomer implying that this is a new, fresh conversation, is verstandig, that implies, as Dosal taught Avraham gesagt in Namira, that everything from Vayomer, including taking the water and the bread, etc., is all one conversation. And it sounds like what Avraham Avinu is doing is he's introducing the fact that I'd like to accommodate you, and so therefore, please, the introduction is, please don't pass me by, rather take some water and I'll give you some bread. What's absolutely clear, obviously, is that Avraham Avinu is offering the water and the bread to the three men who are malachim in disguise. The child of 5 years old reading this parasha understands very simply. It's logical to the child that the introduction to this conversation, where we were told the word Vayomer or Vayomar, which implies that the conversation is starting, must have been to the same people. So therefore the name Adonai over here must mean my master's and not the Eibishter's name. Which is actually why Rashi didn't have to immediately say, in this context, the name is a mundane name, because yes, that is unusual in Torah language, but in this context, it makes perfect sense. A child could work it out on his own. Who is Avraham Avinu speaking to when he says, take water and I'll give you bread? He must be speaking to those people, so therefore the Vayomer must be speaking to them too, and therefore the term Adonai must be saying, my masters. But then there is a question. If Avraham Avinu is addressing three individuals, why then is it nit b'lashon rabim not b'lashon yachid? Why is he not speaking in the plural? He's speaking in the singular. He says, in your eyes in the singular. Al nasaber, you in the singular should not pass me by. Me'al avdecha will not pass your servant in the singular. Okay, so the flow of the language implies much more than he must be speaking to the malachim, but it raises the question that he's speaking to individuals, he's speaking to a group as an individual. So Rashi says, I'll tackle that. Rashi. He's addressing his conversation to the senior, the leader of the group. The statement, please don't pass me by, was addressed only at the leader of the group. That's why I said it in the singular. You'll say, if that's in the singular, why is the word masters in the plural? But if then you'll ask, there are three people besides that. We'll ask a simpler question. Is that how you deal with people? Avraham Avinu sees them as people at this point, right? Is that how you deal with them? You only speak to one of them? It's not really, it's not nice that you focus all your attention on one of them. Even if he is the most senior member of the delegation. So how is it that Avraham Avinu is only speaking to one out of the three people? He's never met them before. It seems like it's disrespectful that he's only speaking to one of them. So Rashi explains, don't worry, he wasn't disrespectful. He addressed them all with a title of honor. He called them my masters. Just the particular suggestion that he made, don't pass me by, but rather come wash your feet and have something to eat. That is given a Godosh Behem. That was directed at the leader. But the idea of, so to speak, addressing them and giving them a title, before he gets into the details, that is given that was equally to all of them. He called them all my masters. Now, there's still a question. Surely what Avraham Avinu wanted was that all three of them should be his guests. So why does he say, you, the individual, don't pass me by? He should have said, you, the group, don't pass me by, because I'd like to have you all as my guests. So again, Rashi explains it. Rashi explains. He did taka say only to the leader of the group, please don't pass by without giving me the opportunity to host you. And then Rashi explains that if the leader is not going to leave, then nobody's going to leave. And that way he'll have them all as guests. Practically, by asking the leader to stay behind, everybody would stay behind, and they'd all be his guests. And so, effectively, that tells us why Rashi had to add all of these details into his commentary, because it certainly makes sense that the flow of the language is that he's speaking to these malachim, and we have to deal with the incongruency of calling them all masters because he wants to show them honor, but speaking only to the leader because he's going to determine what happens next and that they should be able to stay as guests. But there's still a problem with this explanation. So why is Avraham Avinu taking this roundabout route? If he wants everybody to stay, why is he only speaking to the leader and saying, you make the decision on behalf of the group? He could have just said, listen, all of you, please don't leave, please come join me. Und agam, as in der Bakasha zu say, is nitokin tieles, was sei wie bleiben toll in der Machlot von dem Gottes Avraham. You'll say, well, maybe he's wasting his time speaking to the group because the leader is the one who's going to make the decision whether or not they stay. Von deswegen, wie bald das durchsagen al nasaber, no zum Gottes Avraham. But we do know that if Avraham Avinu is only speaking to the leader, kem and meinen azay dafkenit, it could have made the impression or given the message, conveyed the message, listen, I only want him to stay and not you guys, that's why I'm speaking to him in the singular. So maybe Avraham Avinu should have been much clearer and said, none of you should pass, please, I'd love to have all of you as my guests. So because of that minor problem with this interpretation, Rashi offers the possibility of another interpretation. That actually the word Adnai over here is the Eibishter's name, it's a holy name. We speak to the Eibishter. When he said, Eibishter, don't go away, that's what he was saying. He wasn't addressing these three men as an introduction to the proposal he was going to make to them, which is, please stay with me, I want to feed you and host you. But rather, not some Eibishter, he was addressing it to the Eibishter. Please don't leave, because I'm going to now run and invite some guests in, and maybe it will appear to be disrespectful to the Eibishter, but please, if you will, stay, I'm going to go invite them in, and then I'll come back. Now we can immediately understand why Rashi only offers this as the second explanation, because it definitely has greater difficulties than the first explanation. Of dem Pirush bringt Rashi als zweiter Pirush, das heißt weniger matim zu pshutte shel mikra, wie die erste. The reason Rashi quotes the second, which implies that it is less aligned with the pshat understanding of the pasuk, is for these reasons. Val Aleph, number one. Von dem, was far yukach nogem steht nicht noch einmal Vayomer, is mashma k'nal siftad. The fact, as we've already mentioned, that the Torah does not introduce another Vayomer. In other words, does not give the implication that there are two separate conversations happening here. First, the conversation to the Eibishter, please don't go, and then the conversation to the Malachim, please come and join me. As Vayomer ad no saver is gizaki varon sidish leish anashim, certainly lends itself that the original statement was actually directed at these three Malachim, come men. Second of all, the possibly even bigger question. Basis nit mistaber to sagen, it does not make sense to suggest as b'shas the Eibush is given by Avraham. The Eibush himself is there. So Avraham leifen zu Yorchem ufalosen dem Eibush. Doesn't make sense that Avraham is going to abandon the Eibush and run after the guests. Und halachas kamachame noch beten bei mir so warten FM, especially when you consider that not only is Avraham going, leaving the Eibishter, but he's asking the Eibishter to wait for him. Yes, we know the Gemara says that from here we learn that but that's not pshat. To suggest that this is a lesson in how important it is to host people, that you can even put the divine presence on hold, that is certainly not pshat, so it's not going to work for Rashi. Not only that, there's no logical reason why the Eibishter should wait. Because as soon as these malachim arrived, one of them had the mission to heal Avraham Avinu from the bris. So logic says that as soon as the malachim were in the vicinity, Avraham Avinu would have already been healed even before they physically entered his tent. Because if there's a healing through a malach, there's no hesitation, there's no postponement, there's no delay in the healing. And seeing as the reason they visited Avraham Avinu was to do bikul cholim, then kumtois as nach ankommen von dem Malachim Urufo Ase shene given the time as David soll sein bei him. Well then, if the Malachim have now healed him, and the only reason that the Eibishter is there is to visit him while he's sick, then there's no reason for the Eibishter to be there because now he's healed. So how could Avraham Avinu ask of the Eibishter to remain behind if there's really no reason for the Eibishter to have to remain behind? That's why Rashi could only put this as the second or secondary explanation of this pasuk. Because yes, there might be a question about who Avraham Avinu was speaking to, if he's speaking in the singular or the plural, and why would he only address the leader of the group instead of everybody? But that is not nearly as major a question as why the Torah didn't use the word Vayomer again, and to suggest that Avraham Avinu is going to make the Eibishter wait for him, especially when the Eibishter, so to speak, has no purpose being there at this point because he's been healed. That will also help us understand why in the first explanation, Rashi first gives us the explanation and then tells us that in this context, Adonai is a mundane word. Whereas in Kodesh sagt gleich Mamonod von zweiten Pirish. Whereas in the second explanation, first he creates the parameters that this is a name of holiness, it's the Eibishter's name, and then he gives his explanation. Why is that important? Because the simplest reading of the Psukim lends itself to the fact that Avraham Avinu is speaking to the Malachim. As we've already illustrated, that is the smoothest way to read these Psukim. Und der Rebbe is in Demesh and Pirish, wo the Chiddush is not das, was the Godash Behem Amar. So what's the innovation, what's the input that that Rashi is giving us over here in the first explanation is that Avraham Avinu is speaking to the greatest of the three Malachim. So he doesn't have to immediately tell us that it's a mundane name, because that's not the insight that he's giving in this particular explanation. But because it does remain a bit odd for us to associate the name Adnai, it's not out of the question, but it's less common with a human. So therefore Rashi at the end of his Pirish just clarifies for us that it is possible to have the word Adnai in a pasuk, and it is not referring to the Eibush, it's referring to human beings. It might come as a surprise to you, so therefore I'm going to tell you that information. Whereas in the second explanation, Rashi immediately dives into telling us that the name Adnai is a holy name. Why is it so important right at the beginning? Val Aleph, number one, to sagen as Adnai dois Kiddush is a Chiddush. Because firstly, it is a bit of a surprise to us that here the name Adnai actually refers to the Eibishter Chanal, as von Hemshach HaKsuvim is mashma as a ter dobat tzitzich zu de anoshim. Because as we've already illustrated, the flow of the conversation makes it sound like Avraham Avinu is speaking to the people, not to the Eibishter. So it's a surprise to us that he's actually speaking to the Eibishter, and therefore the name over here is a Kodesh name. And second of all, Beis, what's going to prove that Avraham Avinu is speaking to the Eibishter and not to the people is it's because we would like the name Adnai here to be the same uniform as it is everywhere else in the Torah where Adnai refers to the Eibishter. So if that's the, so to speak, the linchpin for our conversation, on the Farhayt on Rashi Kodesh, Rashi tells it to us right at the beginning of the conversation. So Madgishtain in dem because Rashi wants us to know that it is that word in its normal interpretation, which is what propels us to suggest that here he's speaking to the Eibishter. Now, we've already illustrated that neither of these two explanations is absolutely smooth, and the truth is, both of them are actually quite distant from what would have been the simplest, most direct, most pure version of Pshat. That's why Rashi then adds to us that both these expressions are in Bereshis Rabbah, as the mocker from Beida Pirushim is in Medrash. He wants us to know that the source of both of these explanations is specifically a Medrash. Why? Because Medrash is a different method of learning Torah to Pshat, even though even though this is a Medrash that is selected to help us clarify the Pshat, but it is a Medrash nonetheless. The Faz Dr. Rashi, therefore Rashi says, that's why Rashi only tells us the source once he's given the explanation, because it's once you've got the explanation you think, wow, this does not really seem like Pshat. Because only once you've learned both of the explanations and seen that neither one of them fits comfortably into the world of Pshat, as done, that's where Rashi has to clarify that this is actually a midrashic explanation, because the Pshat explanation is not so straightforward. Which also explains why Rashi is quoting it from the Medrash and not from the Gemara. By highlighting that this is specifically the Medrash, he wants us to understand that both of these explanations are Agada, which is the part of Torah that is not absolute Pshat, it's allegorical. Whereas Gemara, very often things are quoted in Gemara from Psukim, and they are Pshat. So if you had heard that this was from the Gemara, you might have actually thought that this is the direct Pshat, which Rashi wants to tell us it is not. And basically illustrating that the two ways in which we're going to interpret this pasuk, each one will have a loose end. And so we need the two to give us perspective of what was actually going on over here. And possibly it's a mixture of both. Possibly he's speaking to the Malachim, to the Eibishter as well.